That engine didn't fail, it just stopped trusting you. The voice came from behind them, low and steady, cutting clean through the laughter like a blade through thin air. The group of airmen turned almost in unison, their boots scraping against the sun-baked tarmac as the late afternoon heat shimmered above the runway. The P-51 Mustang sat silent between them, its polished aluminum skin catching the golden light, its propeller frozen mid-arc like a relic pulled out of time. It had been grounded for weeks, maybe longer. Every system checked green. Every diagnostic returned clean. And yet, it refused to start. To the young technicians in crisp uniforms, it was an outdated machine with a stubborn glitch. To the man standing a few yards behind them, it was something else entirely. Samuel Carter stood with his hands tucked into the pockets of a faded canvas jacket, the fabric worn thin at the seams, darkened by years of oil and sun. He looked out of place among the clean lines of modern equipment and digital screens, like a ghost that had wandered onto the wrong decade. One of the airmen snorted under his breath. "You hear that? The old guy thinks the plane has trust issues." A few chuckles followed, light at first, then louder as confidence fed itself. Another shook his head, tapping the tablet in his hand. "We've run full diagnostics 3 times. Fuel pressure is perfect. Ignition system checks out. There's nothing wrong with this aircraft." Samuel didn't respond. His pale blue eyes stayed fixed on the Mustang, not the men around it. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the faint scent of heated metal and old fuel across the runway. Somewhere in the distance, a modern jet roared to life, its sound sharp and aggressive, a different language entirely. Samuel's gaze didn't waver. A lieutenant stepped forward then, Lieutenant Eric Dalton, his posture rigid, his uniform pressed to perfection. He had the look of someone who had never known a machine he couldn't control. "Sir," Dalton said, the words stripped of any real respect, "this is a restricted maintenance area. I'm going to have to ask you to step back." Samuel finally turned his head, just slightly. Not enough to fully face him, just enough to acknowledge the voice. "You already asked," he said quietly. Dalton's jaw tightened. Behind him, another airman let out a short laugh. "Maybe. He thinks he can fix it with a wrench and a prayer." That got a bigger reaction. A few heads nodded. Someone muttered something about museum mechanics. Samuel ignored all of it. Instead, he took a slow step closer to the aircraft, his boots making a soft, deliberate sound against the concrete. The movement was small, but it shifted something in the air. Dalton noticed. "That's close enough," he snapped, stepping into Samuel's path. "We've got trained personnel handling this." Samuel's eyes moved past him, settling again on the engine cowling, on a line so fine it was almost invisible unless you knew where to look. He didn't touch it. "Not yet." "Trained on what?" he asked, his voice still calm. "Screens." The word hung there, heavier than it should have been. Dalton frowned, not fully understanding why it bothered him. "On systems you wouldn't recognize," he shot back. "This isn't the 1940s. For the first time, something flickered in Samuel's expression. Not anger, not even irritation, just a distant recognition, like a memory brushing against the surface. The wind picked up again, rattling a loose panel somewhere along the fuselage with a faint metallic tick. Samuel heard it instantly. None of the others did. His eyes narrowed just a fraction, focusing, listening in a way that had nothing to do with computers or readouts. Behind Dalton, one of the younger airmen leaned in toward another and whispered, just loud enough. "Guy probably saw one of these in a history book and thinks he's an expert." The laughter came again, sharper this time. Dalton didn't stop them. He didn't need to. In his mind, the situation was already handled. An old man out of place. A problem already under control. But Samuel didn't move away. Instead, slowly, almost absently, his hand rose to the left side of his jacket. His fingers brushed against something small, something metal, worn smooth by time. It caught the light for just a second before his hand stilled over it. Dalton's eyes followed the movement without thinking. He hadn't noticed it before. A set of wings. Old. Tarnished. Not standard issue. He squinted slightly, taking a step closer, curiosity cutting through his annoyance. "Where'd you get those?" he asked, a hint of skepticism creeping into his tone. Samuel didn't answer right away. The air seemed to hold its breath around them, the distant roar of engines fading into something quieter, older. His thumb traced the edge of the metal, and for a fleeting moment, His eyes didn't see the runway anymore. They saw sky. Not the calm blue above them now, but something deeper, something alive with motion and meaning. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, but it carried further than before. "Earn them," he said. And somewhere, beneath the polished surface of the silent Mustang, something seemed to shift. Lieutenant Dalton's gaze lingered on the wings longer than he intended, his eyes narrowing as if trying to reconcile something that did not quite fit. The metal was not polished like regulation insignia, not sharp or precise. It was worn down at the edges, dulled by time, and something far less forgiving than weather. "Earn them," Dalton repeated under his breath, the words sounding thinner the second time. Behind him, one of the airmen let out a quiet scoff. "Yeah, sure. My grandfather has a box full of those kinds of things." A few of the others shifted, their confidence still intact, but not quite as loud as before. There was something in the way the old man had said it that did not invite argument, and that alone was enough to unsettle the rhythm they had built. Samuel lowered his hand from the wings and stepped closer to the Mustang, this time without stopping. Dalton hesitated for a fraction of a second before moving to block him again, but the pause cost him. Samuel was already beside the aircraft, his presence quiet but absolute, as if the space had always belonged to him. The aluminum skin reflected his figure in a warped, shimmering outline. He studied it without touching, his eyes tracing lines no one else seemed to notice. The ticking sound came again, faint and irregular, almost lost beneath the distant hum of bass activity. Samuel tilted his head slightly, listening, not to the noise itself, but to the absence around it. Dalton followed his gaze, then glanced back at the tablet in his hand, as if it could reassure him. "There is no fault in that section," he said, more firmly this time. "We ran a full system sweep. Everything checks out." Samuel did not look at him. "That is the problem," he said. One of the airmen crossed his arms. "So now perfect readings are a bad thing." The sarcasm came quickly, but it landed softer than expected. Samuel crouched slowly near the engine cowling, his movements deliberate, controlled. He did not rush. He did not fumble. He simply observed. His fingers hovered an inch from the surface, feeling the heat radiating off the metal, reading it like a language the others had never learned. The wind shifted again, carrying a low whisper through the open intake. Samuel closed his eyes for just a second. When he opened them, the runway was still there, the sun still low, the men still watching him with a mix of doubt and curiosity. But something behind his eyes had changed. "It is not the engine," he said quietly. Dalton exhaled sharply. "We know that." Samuel shook his head once. "No. You checked the engine. You did not check what the engine listens to." That drew a confused look from more than one face. One of the younger airmen stepped forward slightly, his brow furrowed. "What does that even mean?" Samuel finally reached out and placed his hand gently against the panel, not pressing, just resting it there. The contact was brief, but it seemed to settle something, like a missing piece sliding into place. "Fuel flow," he said. "Not pressure. Flow." Dalton immediately glanced back at his tablet. "Flow rate is within tolerance," he replied, almost instantly. Samuel nodded, as if he expected that answer. "On your screen," he said. The words were calm, but they carried a weight that made Dalton's grip tighten slightly. A beat passed, then another. The airmen exchanged glances. The confidence was still there, but now it had edges. Samuel stood back up slowly, his joints stiff but his posture steady. He looked at the Mustang again, then at the wings on his jacket, as if the two were somehow connected by something invisible. "You are measuring what should be," he said. "Not what is." The ticking sound came again, louder this time, or maybe just clearer now that someone had finally chosen to hear it. Dalton looked toward the engine, then back at Samuel. For the first time, the certainty in his expression cracked, just enough to let something else through. Not belief. Not yet. But doubt. And doubt, on a runway like this, was the beginning of everything. The ticking did not stop this time. It grew clearer, more defined, like a clock that had been ignored too long and finally demanded attention. One of the younger airmen shifted uneasily, glancing toward the engine as if expecting something to reveal itself. "You hear that?" he muttered. Another shrugged, but his eyes stayed locked on the panel now. Dalton lowered his tablet slightly, the glow of the screen no longer holding the same authority it had moments ago. "It is thermal expansion," he said, though the explanation came slower than before. Metal adjusts in heat. Samuel gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Metal adjusts, he said quietly, but it does not hesitate. The word lingered. Hesitate. It did not belong in a technical briefing, and yet it fit the sound in a way none of their readings had. Samuel stepped closer again, this time tracing the seam of the panel with his eyes, following a path that seemed invisible to everyone else. He crouched slightly, angling his view along the curve of the cowling, letting the light catch the surface just right. There, barely noticeable, was a difference. Not a gap, not damage, just a subtle misalignment, no more than the thickness of a sheet of paper. Dalton saw him focus and instinctively moved closer, his own eyes scanning the same area. At first, he saw nothing. Then, slowly, the line appeared. His breath caught, just enough to betray the shift. That is within tolerance, he said, but the certainty was gone. Samuel did not argue. He simply reached out again, this time pressing lightly against the panel, then releasing. The metal gave a faint, almost reluctant sound in response. Not a click, not quite a creak, something in between. The ticking followed it, slightly off rhythm now, like a conversation between parts that no longer agreed. Samuel straightened, his gaze moving to the intake. Fuel is arriving, he said, but not evenly. One of the airmen frowned. That is not possible. The system regulates flow automatically. Samuel looked at him then, really looked at him, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet patience. Automatically, he repeated, based on what it expects, not on what this engine remembers. The words drew a few confused glances, but no laughter this time. The space had changed. The air felt tighter, heavier, like something important was unfolding and no one wanted to be the one who missed it. Dalton stepped forward, closer then. Before, his attention no longer divided. Explain it, he said. Samuel glanced back at the Mustang, his eyes softening just slightly. When these were new, tolerances were different. Fuel moved through lines that were not perfect, just consistent. Over time, the metal shifts. Not enough to fail, just enough to forget its rhythm. He tapped lightly on the panel again, right where the misalignment Saturday. This line feeds uneven pressure into the carburetor. Your sensors see acceptable numbers. The engine feels hesitation. The word came back, stronger now. Dalton looked at the panel again, then at his tablet, then back at Samuel. The data still said everything was fine. But the sound, the subtle irregularity, the line in the metal, all of it told a different story. One of the younger airmen took a hesitant step forward. So what are you saying? Samuel met his eyes. I am saying, he replied, his voice steady and certain, that this aircraft is telling you exactly what is wrong. You just do not know how to listen. The wind passed over the runway again, brushing against the silent propeller, stirring it just enough to make it shift a fraction of an inch. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but this time everyone saw it, and no one laughed. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, the kind that settles in when certainty begins to slip. Lieutenant Dalton looked back down at his tablet one more time, as if hoping the numbers would change under pressure, but the screen remained the same, clean and confident, untouched by doubt. Around him, the airmen no longer spoke. Their earlier laughter had drained away, replaced by something quieter, something watchful. Samuel Carter stood beside the Mustang with the same stillness he had carried from the beginning, but now that stillness felt heavier, anchored in something none of them could measure. The ticking sound came again, sharper now that it had been named, each irregular beat impossible to ignore. Dalton exhaled slowly and stepped closer to the panel, crouching just enough to align his eyes with the seams Samuel had been studying. He reached out, hesitated for a fraction of a second, then pressed lightly against the metal in the same spot. The response was immediate. Not dramatic, not obvious, but there. A faint resistance followed by a subtle give, like a system correcting itself too. Late. Dalton pulled his hand back and looked at it, as if expecting to see something different. Open it, Samuel said quietly. The words were not a command, but they carried more authority than anything Dalton had said all afternoon. One of the airmen blinked. Sir, that panel is factory sealed. If we break it, we have to file. Dalton cut him off with a small motion of his hand. His eyes remained fixed on the Mustang. The hesitation was still there, but it was no longer about protocol. It was about choice. about stepping away from what he knew and into something he did not fully understand. The wind shifted again, brushing across the runway, carrying with it the faint scent of oil and sun-warmed metal. Dalton stood up slowly. "Give me a wrench," he said. The words landed quietly, but they changed everything. One of the airmen moved immediately, jogging to the tool cart and returning with a standard issue wrench set. He handed it over without a word. Dalton took it, then paused, glancing once at Samuel. There was no reaction, no approval, no urgency, just that same steady presence. Dalton turned back to the panel and positioned the wrench on the first bolt. The metal gave a soft, reluctant sound as it loosened, breaking a seal that had not been touched in years. One by one, the bolts came free, each turn slower than the last, as if the aircraft itself was aware of what was being uncovered. When the final bolt loosened, Dalton hesitated again, his hand resting against the edge of the panel. Then, carefully, he pulled it free. The interior was clean. Too clean. Lines and components arranged exactly as expected, nothing visibly broken, nothing obviously wrong. One of the airmen leaned in. "See? There is nothing there." But Samuel stepped forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the inside. "Look closer," he said. Dalton leaned in again, this time not searching for damage, but for difference. And then he saw it. A slight deviation in one of the fuel lines, barely perceptible, a subtle bend where there should have been none. It was not enough to trigger a fault, not enough to fail inspection, but enough to disrupt something deeper, enough to create hesitation. Dalton reached in carefully, tracing the line without touching it, following its path until the pattern became clear. His breathing slowed, his focus narrowing. Behind him, the airmen watched in silence, their earlier confidence replaced by something closer to respect, though none of them said it out loud. Samuel remained where he was, hands at his sides, eyes steady. "It does not need to be replaced," he said. "It needs to be corrected." Dalton nodded once, almost to himself. The tablet in his other hand dimmed and went dark. For the first time that day, he was no longer looking at the screen. He was looking at the machine, and he was finally listening. Dalton's hand hovered just above the fuel line, his fingers steady, but his mind recalibrating with every second. The bend was subtle, almost respectful in the way it avoided detection, like it had learned how to exist just inside the margins of acceptable error. He glanced back at Samuel, not for permission, but for confirmation. Samuel gave the smallest nod, the kind that carried no instruction, only certainty. Dalton reached into the open panel carefully, applying just enough pressure to the line to ease it back into alignment. The metal responded slowly, resistant at first, then yielding with a faint shift that could be felt more than heard. It was not force. It was correction. He adjusted his grip, following the curve, making micro movements measured in fractions of an inch until the line settled into a position that felt right. Not perfect, not textbook, but consistent. Behind him, one of the airmen leaned forward, watching closely. "That is not in the manual," he said quietly. Dalton did not look up. "Neither is the problem," he replied. The word surprised even him. Samuel stepped closer to the panel, his eyes scanning the line now that it had been corrected. He listened again, not with his ears alone, but with a kind of practiced stillness that seemed to pull information from the air itself. The ticking sound came once more, softer now, more even. Not gone, but no longer out of rhythm. Samuel nodded once. "Now I can breathe," he said. Dalton withdrew his hand slowly, careful not to disturb the alignment. He stared at the line for a moment longer, committing its position to memory, then reached for the panel. "Close it," Samuel said. Dalton paused. "We are not going to test it first." Samuel shook his head. "You already did." Dalton exhaled through his nose, then replaced the panel, securing each bolt with deliberate precision. The wrench turned with a clean, final sound as the last bolt seated. The aircraft looked exactly as it had before. Silent. Still. Unchanged. And yet, everything about it felt different. Dalton stepped back, wiping his hand on his uniform without thinking. He looked at the Mustang, then at the airmen around him. No one spoke. The earlier noise, the confidence, the casual dismissals, all of it had been replaced by something quieter, something that demanded attention rather than attention-seeking. "All right," Dalton said finally, his voice lower now, more grounded. "Let us see it." One of the airmen moved toward the cockpit, climbing up with a new kind of care, as if the aircraft deserved it. He settled into the seat, hands moving over controls that suddenly felt less like switches and more like a conversation waiting to happen. The others stepped back instinctively, forming a loose perimeter around the Mustang. Samuel did not move. He stood exactly where he had been, his eyes on the propeller, his posture unchanged. The starter engaged with a low mechanical whine, followed by a brief pause that seemed to stretch longer than it should. Dalton felt it in his chest, that hesitation, the same one Samuel had named. Then the engine turned. Once. Twice. The sound was different now. Not louder. Not more powerful. Just certain. The propeller caught, the blades slicing through the air as the engine came alive with a deep, steady hum that rolled across the runway like a long-held breath finally released. No stutter. No uneven rhythm. Just motion. Clean and continuous. The airmen froze where they stood, their eyes fixed on the aircraft as if it had performed something impossible. Dalton did not react immediately. He watched, listening, comparing what he heard now to what he had ignored before. The difference was undeniable. Behind him, someone whispered, "How did he?" But the question faded before it could finish. Samuel turned slightly, his gaze shifting from the spinning propeller to the open sky beyond it. The wind moved through his jacket, brushing against the worn wings pinned to his chest. He said nothing. He did not need to. The machine had already spoken for him. The engine did not roar the way modern jets did. It did not scream or tear through the air with force. It settled into a deep, steady rhythm that felt almost human, like a heartbeat finding its pace after being lost for too long. The propeller spun in a clean blur, slicing sunlight into fragments that flickered across the tarmac, and for a moment no one moved, as if stepping forward might break whatever had just been restored. Inside the cockpit, the airman kept his hands light on the controls, his earlier confidence replaced by careful respect, his eyes scanning the gauges that now held steady where before they had only promised stability. "It is holding," he said, his voice lower than before, almost cautious, as if speaking too loudly might undo it. Lieutenant Dalton took a slow step closer, the sound of the engine filling the space between thought and instinct, and he listened, really listened this time, not for faults, not for numbers, but for the absence of hesitation. It was gone, completely gone. The rhythm was smooth, continuous, the kind of sound that did not ask for attention because it did not need it. Behind him, the airmen stood in a loose line, their earlier posture of ease replaced by something more deliberate, their eyes no longer searching for flaws but for understanding. One of them glanced toward Samuel, then quickly looked away, as if unsure whether it was appropriate to stare. Samuel Carter remained where he had been, his stance unchanged, his expression unreadable, but there was a subtle shift in the way he held himself now. Not pride, not satisfaction, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had been set right. The wind moved again, brushing against the spinning propeller, carrying the sound across the runway and out into the open space beyond, and for a brief second Samuel's eyes followed it, drawn toward the horizon as if the past had reached forward to meet the present. Dalton noticed. He turned, studying the old man more closely now, not as an interruption, not as a problem to manage, but as a presence he had failed to recognize. His gaze dropped, almost involuntarily, to the worn wings pinned to Samuel's jacket. They caught the light again, dull but unmistakable, shaped by time rather than design. Dalton took a step toward him, slower this time, measured. "Those wings," he said, his voice no longer sharp, no longer dismissive. "What unit were you with?" Samuel did not answer immediately. The engine continued its steady rhythm behind them, filling the silence with something that did not need words. For a moment, it seemed as if Samuel might ignore the question entirely, the same way he had ignored the laughter, the same way he had ignored the doubt. But then he glanced down at the wings, his fingers brushing against them lightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried a different weight, something older, something that did not belong to the present moment alone. "They did not have a name for us," he said. Dalton frowned slightly, not in disbelief, but in confusion. "Every unit has a designation," he replied. Samuel shook his head once, slowly. "Not the ones that were not supposed to exist." The words settled heavily, pulling the air with them. One of the airmen shifted, his boots scraping softly against the concrete, the sound loud in the quiet that followed. Dalton held his gaze, searching for something more, something concrete he could anchor to, but Samuel had already looked away, his attention drifting back to the Mustang, to the machine that now ran as if it had never failed. The realization did not come all at once. It unfolded, piece by piece, like a pattern forming out of scattered details. The wings. The way he listened. The way he knew. Dalton felt it before he fully understood it, a subtle shift in perspective that made everything from the past hour look different. Behind him, the engine continued its steady hum, unwavering, undeniable. And for the first time since the old man had spoken, no one questioned him. The engine continued its steady rhythm, filling the space with a low, confident hum that no longer demanded attention because it had already earned it. The air around the Mustang felt different now, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but anchored in something solid that none of them could deny. Lieutenant Dalton stood still for a moment longer, his eyes shifting between the aircraft and Samuel, as if trying to reconcile two truths that had not aligned before. Behind him, one of the airmen quietly stepped away from the group, pulling a phone from his pocket with careful discretion. He turned slightly, lowering his voice as he made a call that did not follow the usual chain of routine maintenance reports. "Sir, we might have something you should hear," he said, his tone controlled but carrying an edge that suggested more than a routine update. A pause followed, then a few quiet words exchanged, and his posture straightened just slightly before he ended the call. He did not announce it. He did not need to. Something had already been set in motion. Back on the tarmac, Dalton took another step towards Samuel, his earlier authority replaced by something more measured. "You said they did not have a name," he said carefully. "Then how would anyone know you were part of it?" Samuel did not look at him right away. His gaze remained on the Mustang, watching the propeller spin with a kind of quiet familiarity, as if the motion itself carried memory. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was a depth to it now that had not been there before. "They would not," he said. Dalton frowned slightly. "Then how do you prove it?" The question was not confrontational. It was genuine. Samuel let out a slow breath, the kind that carried more history than effort, and his hand rose again to the wings on his jacket. His fingers rested there, not gripping, not displaying, just acknowledging. "You do not prove things like that," he said. "You carry them." The words settled into the space between them, heavier than any explanation could have been. Dalton looked down at the wings again, this time not searching for authenticity, but for meaning. The worn edges, the softened lines, the way they sat slightly off-center on the jacket, none of it matched regulation, but all of it spoke to something that had never needed regulation to begin with. The sound of approaching tires broke the moment. A dark government vehicle rolled onto the edge of the tarmac, moving with purpose but without urgency, its presence quiet but unmistakable. The airmen noticed it first, their heads turning in near unison. Conversations that had not even started were immediately abandoned. The vehicle came to a smooth stop a short distance away, the engine cutting off with a soft mechanical sigh. The driver stepped out quickly, moving to open the rear door. A colonel emerged, his uniform immaculate, his posture composed, but his eyes already scanning the scene with a level of focus that suggested he had not come for a routine inspection. He did not look at the Mustang first. He looked at the people, at the formation, at the silence, and then his gaze found Samuel. The shift was immediate, subtle, but unmistakable. The colonel's expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention to itself, but enough that Dalton felt it without understanding it. The colonel stepped forward, his pace steady, his eyes never leaving the old man. Around him, the airmen instinctively straightened, their posture tightening as discipline returned in full. Dalton turned slightly, stepping aside without being told. Samuel did not move. He stood exactly where he had been from the beginning, the wind brushing against his jacket, the wings catching the light one more time. The colonel stopped a few feet in front of him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The engine behind them continued its steady hum, the propeller spinning, the aircraft alive in a way it had not been before. Then, slowly, deliberately, the colonel raised his hand in a crisp salute, and the entire runway went still. The salute did not break the silence. It deepened it, pressing down across the runway like a weight that no one dared to disturb. Lieutenant Dalton felt it immediately, a shift so complete it made everything that came before feel distant, almost irrelevant. The colonel held the salute steady, his posture rigid, his expression composed but unmistakably serious, and for a moment it seemed as if time itself had slowed to match the rhythm of the engine behind them. Samuel Carter looked at him, not surprised, not startled, just present, as if this moment had always been waiting somewhere ahead of him. Then, with the same quiet control he had shown from the beginning, he returned the salute. Not sharp, not exaggerated, just precise. Enough to acknowledge, nothing more. The movement was small, but it carried through the entire formation like a signal. Around them, the airmen straightened instinctively, their spines aligning, their shoulders squared, their earlier uncertainty replaced by a disciplined stillness that required no command. Dalton followed a fraction of a second later, raising his own hand, the motion automatic yet heavier than any salute he had given before. The sound of the engine continued, steady and unwavering, filling the silence without breaking it. When the colonel finally lowered his hand, he took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and Samuel. His eyes moved briefly to the wings, then back to the man wearing them. "Sir," he said, his voice controlled, but carrying a respect that did not need emphasis, "we have been looking for you." The words landed softly, but they rippled outward, pulling every eye toward the two men at the center of the runway. Dalton felt his breath catch slightly, not because of what was said, but because of what it implied. Samuel did not react immediately. He glanced once toward the Mustang, its propeller still spinning in a clean, continuous blur, then back to the colonel. "No," he said quietly. "You were not." The colonel held his gaze, unshaken. "Maybe not by name," he replied, "but by record." That word lingered, precise and deliberate. Behind him, the airman who had made the call stood a little straighter, his earlier uncertainty replaced by the quiet confirmation that he had done the right thing. The colonel reached into the inside pocket of his uniform and pulled out a small, worn folder, its edges softened by time. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he held it between them, as if the object itself carried weight beyond its size. "We found references," he continued, "fragments of reports, incomplete logs, aircraft that should not have made it back, but did." He paused, his eyes flicking once more to the wings. All of them tied to one identifier that never matched any official roster. Dalton listened, every word reshaping the way he saw the man standing just a few feet away. The Mustang's engine hummed behind them, steady, alive, almost as if it was part of the conversation now. Samuel's gaze lowered briefly to the folder, then lifted again. "Identifiers were never meant to be traced," he said. The colonel nodded once, as if that confirmed more than it explained. "And yet," he said, "here you are." The wind moved across the runway again, carrying the sound of the engine outward, the propeller cutting the air with a rhythm that no longer hesitated. Around them, the formation held, every airman still, every eye forward, the earlier laughter erased completely, replaced by something far more enduring. Dalton lowered his hand slowly, his posture still rigid, but his understanding no longer anchored in rank or protocol. He looked at Samuel again, not as an outsider, not as a question, but as an answer he had not known how to ask. The colonel stepped slightly to the side, giving space without breaking presence. "We would like you to come with us," he said. Samuel considered that for a moment, his eyes drifting once more to the Mustang, to the machine that now ran without hesitation, its voice steady against the quiet. Then he looked back at the colonel. "It is already flying," he said. And for a moment, no one spoke, because they all understood he was not just talking about the aircraft. The words lingered in the air long after he spoke them, settling over the runway with a quiet finality that no one tried to challenge. The engine continued its steady hum behind them, the propeller cutting clean arcs through the late afternoon light, each rotation smooth, uninterrupted, certain. Lieutenant Dalton stood motionless, his eyes fixed on Samuel Carter, but what he saw now was no longer the man he had dismissed at the edge of the tarmac. The pieces had shifted, the picture had changed, and there was no going back to what he thought he understood. The colonel studied Samuel for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not of authority, but of recognition. "Understood," he said quietly. He did not press further. He did not insist. Some decisions, he knew, were not his to command. Behind them, the airman in the cockpit eased the throttle slightly, the engine responding instantly, its tone deepening with a controlled strength that rolled across the runway and out into the open sky. It was no longer a question of whether the aircraft would run. It was a question of what it had been waiting for. Samuel turned his head just enough to follow the sound, his eyes softening as the Mustang answered with that steady, unwavering rhythm. For a brief moment, something passed across his expression, not nostalgia, not regret, but something quieter, something that belonged to a different time entirely. Then it was gone. Dalton took a slow step forward, his voice careful, stripped of everything it had carried before. "Sir," he said, the word now fully earned, "I was wrong." The admission came without hesitation, without defense, and it hung there, simple and complete. Samuel looked at him, not judging, not correcting, just acknowledging. "No," he said gently. "You just listened late." The words did not carry blame. They carried truth. Dalton nodded once, absorbing it, understanding it in a way that would not leave him. Around them, the airmen stood in perfect stillness, their posture no longer driven by command, but by respect that had settled into place on its own. No one spoke. No one needed to. The moment had already said everything. The colonel stepped back slightly, giving space again, his eyes moving once more to the Mustang, then back to Samuel. "If you ever choose to return," he said, "there will be a place ready." Samuel gave a small nod, not a promise, not a refusal, just an acknowledgement that the offer had been heard. The wind moved across the runway again, carrying the sound of the engine farther this time, out beyond the base, out toward a horizon that stretched wide and open. Samuel adjusted his jacket slightly, his fingers brushing once more against the worn wings pinned to his chest. They caught the light one last time, dull but undeniable, shaped by years no one else had seen. Then he turned. No announcement, no ceremony, just a quiet step away from the aircraft, from the formation, from the moment that had already reached its conclusion. He walked slowly across the tarmac, his figure steady against the fading light, the distance between him and the others growing with each step. No one stopped him. No one called out. Behind him, the Mustang continued to run, its engine smooth, its voice strong, as if it had found its purpose again and refused to lose it. Dalton watched until the old man became a smaller figure against the horizon, his mind replaying every second, every word, every detail he had missed before. The colonel stood beside him in silence, both men facing the same direction, both understanding something that did not need to be spoken. The engine's steady rhythm filled the space between them, constant, unwavering, a reminder that some things do not break. They are simply forgotten until someone remembers how to listen. And on that runway, under a sky that held more history than any record could capture, the lesson remained long after the man who taught it was gone.